However you are and whenever you are, welcome good souls of the planet and beyond to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. Tonight's first hour guest is Kevin Titus, the first official public servant in U.S. history to certify and seal the Thom Reed 1969 case as real and true in U.S. history. And we mean that, true. It is written down as fact as you can get within the confines of the U.S. government. And the second hour guest is Thomas Reed himself of the Reed family's famous 1969 UFO encounter. So hang in there for both hours because you're not going to want to miss this fascinating tale. Share your thoughts and experiences with us during or after the show on Facebook, facebook.com/paranormalnow, Instagram @paranormalnow, and on Twitter, paranormal_now. And of course, join us in the KGRA chat room, which I will be monitoring. And again, I may or may not get your questions, but I will do my best to keep tuned in with y'all. All right. So, Kevin Titus, renowned historian, author of 2 historical books, an IMDb actor, TV shows such as Ancient Aliens, Chronicles, ABC 10 News. He's been on the History Channel, radio and film personality. He is a U.S. presidential historical portrayer, and he is a judge. He was the first official public servant in U.S. history to certify and seal the Thom Reed 1969 case as real and true in U.S. history. Kevin, welcome to Paranormal Now.
Good evening to you all. Thank you for the welcome. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. So there's a lot to talk about the legalese of the process that you went through, which I'm very curious about. But let's give a recap of the Reed story to lead into that.
Well, as you all know, it was September 1st, 1969. The Thom Reed family had an event where they were coming back from a horse show, I believe, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and they were heading home. And they were going across the historic Sheffield covered bridge down that old dirt road where the UFO Monument Park now is. And they were, I'm not sure the exact time, but it was getting dark, and Thom and his family saw lights coming from all around the covered bridge as they were heading home and across the water into the big fields, which is now, they're a cornfield, and they were then and they are now. And as he was going across with his family, he got down to the historical electrical pole, which is still down there in the park area. And about that time, the vehicle, family car, station wagon, I believe it was, stopped completely. They, for approximately 2 hours or a little more, Thom Reed's family had no idea what had happened because they were somewhat unconscious or not in the realm that you would be normally for most of us when you're aware of things. And from that point on, when they came back to being awake again, Thom Reed and his family could not explain other than what they saw, and they saw a craft that was kind of some people call it an ice cream type shape or an oval shape, and it had lights, and it was moving at an unusual speed to the left side of the road, where he looked up, and the family and everything just happened just like that. And it just, he can tell you what happened in those 2.5 hours or so that the family incurred.
Right. And there are a multitude of eyewitnesses. Does that play into your ability to have signed this into history?
Right. I started after the way it happened. I bumped into some years back. I was going to the covered bridge with my wife, and we were taking a look and looking for historical markers, and I saw this big marker. And when I went over to walk to it, I looked to it, and I said, oh, that could be a Shays Rebellion monument because that occurred in the area. And I looked over, and there was this plaque talking about the 1969 UFO case, and I recall that as a child because I was home that very same weekend that Thom Reed was at his home when this occurred. I'll tell you a little more about that, too. Mm-hmm. But as you come across the monument, I looked at it, and I was reading it, the original one, which is not there. We have a new one out there now. And it was realized when I looked down and I saw Thom Reed and I saw his father's name, and I said, wait a minute, I know Thom Reed. We all came from the same neck of the woods in the Litchfield County area and in the Berkshire County area. We all the kids, we were little communities. Everybody knew everybody around here. And I knew Thom because his father was a town selectman. He had a doctorate, very well known by the United Nations, and he was very well known by every people in the community around here. In fact, my grandparents were very close friends with the Reeds, so that's why I knew them very well. And then I decided to contact Thom, and I went through the police department in Sheffield, and I believe I spoke to the chief of police and asked him if he knew how to get a hold of Thom. And he had told me that he did, and I gave him my number, and I guess he maybe thought maybe this gentleman might be some kind of a strange person. He wanted to check with Thom to make sure that it was all right to communicate with me. And Thom called me, and we started connecting and realized that what had gone on is historical. And I remember because as I researched it, you go back to 1969, over 250 plus people heard and saw something within a 12-mile radius of Sheffield, including in the area where I live. And it got me interested enough because I remember something of my own age at that time where a friend of mine named Jimmy and I were on the property that I now own now. It's 190 acres in Northwest Connecticut, where the the craft was seen by not only Jimmy and I was about 12 years old, but his family as well. And I'll get into that more after. But
Sure.
You could see how I finally decided that looking at this and being a historian, and I've written 2 books about history, I said, I'm going to research this. And I got a hold of Thom, and Thom asked me if I would come aboard with this, and I felt very strongly that I would. And then I commenced researching it and seeing all the government papers that I could find, and I did find quite a few. And I'll give you one example. The Great Barrington private airport that's now there was originally a military reserve air base where they used to have some kind of testing of special aircraft up in that area. So until 1974, that was an active military base. And I remember that people called that base and called the various policemen and police departments in the area and WSBS radio, who are chronicled the phone calls of panic from people. And it was turned out that over 250 people not only saw it and heard it, but people were so worried about what they had seen, that made me want to look into it more. And when I did, I finally found out that the government had actual records of something that occurred on September 1st, 1969, and what it said was there was no helicopters, there was no airplanes up there that they knew of, but they saw something very strange on the radar that day. So that got me very interested, and I started to research this, and I got really deep into it and saw various articles and documents. So you can tell from there, you can see something really happened that day.
Clearly something happened that day. Now, in the records, it's saying that there's not helicopters and not something else in the sky, but it behaved erratically on radar? Is that...
Yes, what they said, according to the documents that I found from the U.S. government, they had said that the craft as what you like to call an unidentified flying object, was seen on the radar coming from the northwest and going, northeast. And it stopped at a particular area, according to the radar, which was, guess what, approximately where Thom Reed was and his family. And then you see it had stayed in that general area within a 12-mile range for approximately, it looked like, according to the archives, it was there for at least 2.25 hours in that area. So that kind of makes sense, what happened to Thom and what other people saw.
Who at the time was leading any sort of investigation?
Well, there was, that I know of, the government didn't really want to look into an investigation because, there was also government things going on in the area, such as, there were special craft that used to be tested out here in the Berkshire Hills, and people didn't really know about that. In fact, there's still some places around here that are marked U.S. government stay out in a lime rock quarry, and I don't know a lot of your viewers or your listeners were, but back in World War II, the U.S. government used what is called limeate, which is made of lime, which was the igniter for the atomic bomb. And that was made and found in this area of Litchfield County, such as North Canaan, Falls Village, Lime Rock, even up in the Richmond, Berkshire area. So you see, that's kind of suspicious too, if you know what I mean.
I do. When you first looked into this, are you more of a skeptic, or were you a believer right off the bat?
What I am is a great way to take this. Good question. I am a historian as well, and I research historical fact. And what I did was I researched everything that was factual about this thing. I mean, I'm talking about right up to the governor's signature on the documents. And when you sign something and certify something, you're pretty sure, because when you're putting your name and your seal on something, this is not a joke. It's not a game. It's because I've researched it very thoroughly, and I found that there was definitely documents and evidence to prove that something did occur, and that Thom Reed and his family did experience something very, very unusual on September 1st of 1969.
Well, I suppose what I'm asking is, were you a believer before you even started this research?
I've always believed that there's other things in this world besides us. There's got to be other humanoids, if you wish to call it, other galaxies where there's other humanoids such as us, or other type people, if you'd like to say. And in the 50s and 60s, and even during World War II in the 40s, there was a lot of things going on in here, and UFOs were very common, such as the Thomas Mantell deal. You've ever heard of that? In 1948, he was a famous pilot from World War II, ace pilot, in fact, shot down numerous German planes during the war, and he was now in the Kentucky National Guard. And on this date in January 1948, he was flying, and he saw a UFO, and so did the majority of his National Guard air team, and they were flying the P-51G models that were capable of getting speeds up to 450 to 500 miles an hour on a dive. And what he did is he went up after this UFO, and he said, according to the radio transcripts and everything else, that he saw actual occupants inside the UFO. And when he got to see that they were being evasive or aggressive, he wanted to go after, but he didn't have any guns. The only 2 or 3 of them were armed with any kind of machine guns or cannon fire, and they weren't in the area. They were coming to meet him, and by the time they got to him to intercept, he had already been shot down in a sense and crashed in Kentucky. Yeah, I believe. I know that thing happened, and this man was not somebody that would make it up either. He was an ace from World War II, you know?
Where does your skeptical side come into any UFO investigation? Do you come across cases where you don't believe? Or you just always take it on like the face value because there are good eyewitnesses? Or do you need more than that?
Well, I feel that anybody can tell you a case, and I'm not saying they didn't see it or didn't occur, but there are some people that could be incorrect or not making it up, because there are facts that you can find out. I'll give you that example. When you seek out facts and they don't look real, or there's no evidence to back it up with, then it becomes contradictory, or you're not sure you believe it because these people might be just trying to make something up. But when you look at the Thom Reed case and the facts behind it, there's so much evidence, so much that and the government documents is what sealed it for me when I saw those. Those made me believe without a shadow of doubt that something occurred. I can't tell you exactly what Thom experienced. He will tell you that. But I know what the facts are that did occur. And so I won't say that I'm not skeptical. I believe that anything's possible, and my old theory was like my grandparents used to tell me, if you can't explain it, don't knock it, because you may not be able to.
Right. And if you knock it too hard and you're wrong later, then you're
going to look like
the joke.
A buffoon.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't knock anybody's stories, but it is really wonderful when you can get actual historical fact. And here's another thing: you get the governor of the state of Massachusetts that signed willingly these documents as it being part of Massachusetts history. That's amazing, because he knows it was true, and when he signs a document, he can't take it back. It's like he knows the facts were there. He knows it's true. It's now part of Massachusetts history. It's now a part of the United States history. Eventually, it's going to be part of international history. I think it's gone international at this point anyhow.
You're all in.
Yeah. I mean, but go ahead.
Well, earlier you had mentioned windows in a craft, and I remember when I was first reading about UFO reports, especially from the 60s and 50s, and you hear about these windows, and there was something kind of science fiction about it. But through the decades, that report continued. You would have these crafts with these windows. Up until the most recent that was nearly, caught on camera, was the Kumburgas Turkey UFO. I hope I'm saying that name. I can never get that right.
I know the one you're talking of.
And that was in the 2008-ish. Why do you think that these crafts would have windows like that? I mean, if you're interstellar, doesn't it seem a bit odd that you would have that if you're going at super hyper speeds?
Well, let's use an example. Let's try this first. When you see an old science fiction movie about UFOs or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sometimes they're a little bit Hollywoodish, they're a little funny, but if you look at some of the things that have been recorded in history from the 50s, or, what you want to call them imaginations, what people believe is in other planets, have you noticed that a lot of those things today have become reality? And when you talk about windows, what I think is maybe it's not so much windows. It may be, I'm not sure how to call them, but some people call them transparent energy, which kind of opens up a type of metal or material I've heard about and read that could look like a temporary window until they, close it by whatever means.
Mm-hmm.
Then again, you have things such as in the end of World War II, the Germans had this saucer that was actually designed to fly, that had windows and such. It was huge, but they never got up, but the blueprints do exist. And if you realize in history, people have seen such aircraft of that type of size and sketch, and you have pictures of. Now, that tells me that something either could have existed at the end of the war, the Germans could have invented it, maybe the U.S. government decided to invent some things. I mean, the government, you've heard of the old, the Base 51 out there, in New Mexico, where it's all top secret?
Sure.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of unusual craft over there, too. And, what I'm saying is it could have been something of the government, but then again, according to the other versions, like with Thom's family, it could have been something else. We know it was something. It's just an amazing thing that this actually happened, because a lot of people have seen things especially back in the 60s and 50s. There was a lot of that was quite common. People were seeing things, and I don't believe anybody was making that up. Very few, in my opinion.
True. And I also think that the speculation of all this is part of the fun, right?
Exactly.
Because we see these strange things, and it begs questions, and then we have to speculate, postulate, theorize, and in a sense, just like science fiction does, it forces our imaginations to go further. And even if it's something that's extraordinarily bizarre, investigating ufology does require you to push the boundaries. There was a time where, and I think it is to some extent now, where the strictly conservative, nuts and bolts UFO approach based on our human known physics was considered the way to go to get respectability within the community. Not necessarily anymore. There are so many more ufologists who are willing to look beyond the more mundane physics that we're aware of and allow quantum physics and string theory to fertilize their imagination. And I think that's a healthy thing.
I agree with you. If you like, for instance, evidence, as I spoke of earlier, at the UFO Monument Park, there is definite evidence of something that is very unusual out there, and I'll tell you why. They've had some scientists out there some years ago that did some what we call geometric magnetics, checking on the ground out there. Well, on one side on the right side there's a cornfield, and on the left side there's a cornfield where Thom Reed and the family saw the craft. When you go out there, especially in the summer, the corn stalks are bigger than any I've ever seen in the world. Mm-hmm. Some of them are 17 to 20 feet tall. The corn itself is almost the size of your arm. Who in the Lord has ever seen corn like that? And I actually picked a couple pieces off, and when I took them home, they turned black within the second day. Who's going to eat that? Second, and now you go over to the other side, what we call the normal side. The stalks are an average 10 to 12 feet, average-sized corn cobs. Now you tell me what that means. Plus, over there are several spots where absolutely nothing will grow there. I even had family members go out to the cornfield that, don't even really either believe or not believe in these things. And my sister-in-law, she went out there, and she went out to the spot, and she felt very unusual, very weird, almost like she's going to collapse. Mm-hmm. Now, that tells you something's there. And then when you take what we call, they're looking for a form of radioactivity, and they said in the soil, there's a lot of very unusual activity in the soil there. And so that's why that's evidence of something that was over there, because the craft was in that exact area just above the ground. Now, whether it landed there, I don't know, but I do know that it was very low when it came past the covered bridge and went across the fields to about the tree height. And then you can see with the telephone pole where Thom and Reed and the family all stopped. So, when you get these kind of evidence of facts, you see the corn and stalks, that tells me something's unusual there. You can't make that stuff up. You just can't.
No, you can't make that stuff up. What you are talking about is a confluence of events that, in conjunction, lead one to believe that something extraordinary happened there. I remember when I was a kid looking at my back window into the backyard, and mm-hmm. where the grass was, there were these dry, round splotches of grass, and they were like these perfect shape of a circle. And as a kid and into UFOs, I imagined that perhaps spaceships landed in my backyard. But right. the truth is that it was a perfectly natural issue with grass. There was a bacteria in the grass, and it just couldn't grow healthily there. And the bacteria sort of spreads out in the soil in a circular fashion. So I think that we should always give the most mundane, more plausible explanations a shot first before we jump into the fray. But in this case, yes, there are a multitude of facts that add up to something bizarre, so much so that you decided to participate in making it historical fact. Now, that might work within the U.S. government, but does that hold water outside of the U.S. as far as the UN or other countries?
Well, yes, because the Thom Reed case was officially sanctioned and accepted by the United Nations. I don't know the exact date, but the very day after it was accepted by the United Nations, the Thom Reed, his father died very tragically the second day after. And the whole thing went international because it was accepted by the international world as factual that something happened. But nobody but the United Nations, until I came around, was able to certify it as being unique, such as the governor of Massachusetts. So when you think about all these things, I can also tell you that in September 1st, 1969, that very weekend, I was about 12 years old. And the property that I own today was also, they saw the craft that day. And I, with my friend Jimmy and his father, who didn't believe us when we went up there, and I'll tell you the story was, we were there and we were playing around with a .22 caliber rifle like most kids in the country do. And we were asked by his father, because they were bringing the cattle, and it was getting not dark, but it was heading towards nighttime. Mm-hmm. And he said, go get, there's a couple cows missing. So I said, all right, with Jimmy, I'll go with you. And we ran up with our little .22, kind of protect ourselves against any wild animals, which there are a lot of them around here. And as we got up to the top of the plateau, which is on my property today, we looked up there, and to my horror, I found one dead cow on the left-hand side that had been mutilated, ripped apart, as though you thought animals had got to it. But the funny thing was, at 12 years old, I can't make this stuff up, I saw a pinkish color. Didn't see any blood, but it scared the living heck out of me. And I ran down the hill, but before we ran down, Jimmy himself saw several big black burn marks on the top up there, and they found the other cow on the right-hand side in the same condition the next morning. As we ran down the hill, I looked up behind me, and I thought I saw something which looked like it was following us, but I can't say because we're running so fast from the top of a small mountain, or hill as you can call it, there's a lot of mountains here, and running down as fast as we could. And it had the weirdest light hue I've ever seen, and it wasn't a helicopter, and it wasn't a plane. It wasn't making any noise. So we as kids were horrified, and you come running into his father and say, look, we saw such and such, such and such. And, of course, everybody thinks you kids are just full of it. You know, you're just playing and you're making stuff up. And we walked out to the back of the patio of his house, and he looked out, and he saw exactly what we saw. Mm-hmm. He immediately called the local authorities, the sheriff department, and then they called, and then they called the military base in Great Barrington, and then WSBS radio, and the WSBS radio, and Garrett was getting hundreds of calls. People were panicky. They were all calling, and none of these people knew each other. You're talking over 250 people calling the very same thing. So whatever it was, we as kids saw it, and I had forgotten all about it all my life because it's not something you really want to remember, especially when your family say, hey, don't let your son sit in your lap and watch Chiller Theater or Sci-Fi Theater when I was a kid, you know? Mm-hmm. And this is what happened. So when you put this all together and you put all the evidence and you research it, I feel very confident, and I certify because I know I experienced something not like Thom and the Thom Reed family, but other 250 people saw it, including a woman who you may talk to. Her name was Fran, and she said, and I'll quote her, she said, I'll know this and I'll remember it to the day I die. Even if I get Alzheimer's, she's going to remember that. And she's 84 years old. So you see, there's a lot of people. We're getting recordings of people that have seen this, what they saw, and everything seems to match and is very similar. And that also got me to want to research it thoroughly. So you see, the facts are there. There's enough to make it very real and very true.
Well, take us through the legal process. And I just want to add, I was corrected. It's not bacteria that cause the circular or cylindrical, degradation of the grass. It's grubs, apparently grubs for the cause of that. So thank you for that. Yeah, so for the legalese, can you make that as exciting for us as possible, the process that you went through?
Oh, boy. It's quite a process. Well, first of all, of course, as I said before, you have to research it. You have to authenticate it. Then you have to verify people's signatures, such as the governor who signed his documents. Mm-hmm. Then I have to verify with Thom his signature and his documents. I have to research every article that was ever written, if possible, to read. I had to check every government record from this area, and believe me, it takes time to get the government to give you anything. Sometimes they still have some of this stuff on confidential, and on the Freedoms of Information Act, they don't sometimes give you that. But being a judge allowed me to push a little of my authority to say that it may pertain to something in a case in this area, and they gave me the things. So I dug into it and read more, and then I decided that also as a historian, because I'm very reputable for that, I decided that I'm going to go ahead and take this on. So legally, I was able to seal these documents as a public official because, see, as anything, it's just like someone coming to my office or a court and saying, look, Your Honor, I want to certify that this person and I have agreed that he's giving me this or this land. And I'll say, well, I need to see your ID. I need to see your copy of your land survey. I need to see all these things. You have to document all that. Because when you put your name to something like this, you know, you're putting your your accountability, you're putting your name on the line, and you have to know what you're doing before you do it. And then people ask me this question too. Well, have you ever had any problems legally doing it? I said no, because I have the facts and they're based on what I say and what I've researched. And when I found out what I found out, I was very, very much convinced that I'm going to certify these things for Thom Reed. I certified the governor's signature. My papers and a display on me are in the UFO Museum or Hall of Fame Museum in Roswell, New Mexico now forever, so you can see the actual documents and things that I signed many years back.
What paperwork or docs were needed to make this happen? Did you need to get additional documentation to assist in verifying this event, something that you had to sort of put together and officiate?
Oh, yes. I assure you it took me several years to get it to the point where I could do that. And I had to make sure. I mean, I met with people. I know Tom's story. I've met with other witnesses. I've met with people in my general area who some of them, I'll tell you, didn't even want to talk about that day. There was that really got me interested, because when you mention a date and most people say, look, I don't want to talk about the day, or I really did want to talk about it because, people are going to think I'm out of my mind or something. And that makes me realize that some of these people are very true to their feelings of what they saw, which also accounts for actuality and authenticity. And, we've been trying to get all these people's accounts because, a lot of these people have passed already, and some of them will pass soon, and we're trying to get all these other witnesses together, as many as we can, for a book that I believe Thom is going to work on. I'm going to probably work on one, how I certified it for U.S. history. It was quite intense. I mean, it takes a long time because, remember, when you put your seal to something, as I said before, in your signature, especially in a legal document, you better be right.
Well, people distrust the government. As a judge, you kind of are the government. So how do we know you're not working for the government?
Good question. Well, because I'm a historian first, and I believe in facts and truth. I believe that people, for the most part, most people are pretty honest about things in their life, especially ready-duty people, everyday people. Yes, you're going to find this and that, and you're right. They're a government. How can you trust them? Well, because I'm the only one that even wanted to tackle it. I can tell you that one. No one wanted to touch it. Other people were afraid of their credibility or something of that nature. And I, as a historian, don't worry about that because, number one, I have written a book about Bonnie and Clyde, the famous gangsters in the Texas, history in the 30s. And I also wrote a book about a tornado that happened 13 days after 9/11, and it came to Washington, D.C., and then went northwest and destroyed the city of La Plata, Maryland. And most people say, my God, how did you get all those documents? Well, because I research it, I check government documents, and I've seen other things that I once wanted to write about, but I couldn't find enough about it to be convinced to write about it or even sign off on it as something that I considered true, only because I couldn't find enough accounts of anybody mentioning it, you know?
Well, I have a question here. Has there been, or more pertinent, presently, a member of the House or Senate that really has a strong interest in the subject right now? I think it's a good question because as a judge, I would guess that you brush shoulders with some people.
Oh, I have a lot of senator friends. I have some congressman friends, and I consider them friends because they're from the area, and I know them, and I knew their family, and they're very truthful. They're very truthful people. Mm-hmm. I brush with a lot of. I've even brushed with a Supreme Court judge once about it and talked about him when I was in Washington, and he thought it was an amazing story himself. And he said to me, he said, "Boy, if you're the first person that ever writes about this, and it gets to the point of a park and stuff," he said, "you're going to be remembered that for the rest of your life and past that." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, it depends on how it goes." So yes, I've ran into other people who some said they would. There are other cases that they would love to certify or authenticate, but they're afraid to put their foot into it, so to speak.
I wonder if life is imitating art or art is imitating life or both. But in the X-Files was circumfunded by a congressman, I think it was on the show, that Fox Mulder would occasionally speak to in private. And it reminded me later with Harry Reid funding ATIP. I wonder, has this been going on for quite some time? Have there always been someone in the government that's not clandestine necessarily, but quietly funding research or supporting it without being so public about it?
I happen to know, you might know who I'm talking about. There's a former, I think he was a senator for a while or a congressman, then he was a governor for a while, and he's an actor. You might recall who that was. He had something to do with that. And I don't know if I can remember his name, but you might know who I'm talking about.
I don't know, but if anybody listening does know, please let us know in the chat room, the KGRA chat room, or hit me up on Twitter. So, okay, so you're in this process of making this a legitimate historical event. Then, recently, now you've participated in the markers, right? And these landmarks, designating this in a physical form, in reality, a place where people can go and reflect upon this event. Can you tell us about that?
I sure could. I'm glad you asked. Yes, we just Thom, Lenny Morneau, myself, Kathy Siliker, Ava Groves, many other people.
And our own Bill Skywalker was there. Skywatcher.
Oh yeah, I mean all these people have attended, and they just put a beautiful heavy metal, maybe heavy aluminum metal, marking the park with the other monument as what I love it being the first, it being inducted as the first UFO incident to be inducted in history as being true. That's on the marker. We have new benches put out by Ancient Aliens. I think they helped donated the monument there. We've got new benches out there, solar lights that you can go there at night and see this greenish hue that makes you feel very, I don't know how you can reflect on the incident. People go there at night hoping to see something again. And the park, the road that Thom Reed and his family went is exactly the same. Thom and the UFO Money Park own the property now. It is now becoming a historical site. Soon we're going to put it on the National Historical Register of Historical Places. Mm-hmm. And the road is exactly the same. And I mean, the original telephone pole is still in use. It's old and it's still there where the car stopped. There is the cornfields you can go tour and go up there with, and you can take out even a Geiger counter, and you can find out that there's tremendous energy coming out of the one in the left field. There will be another marker that I'm hoping to put up pretty soon. If you'd like to hear what it said, this will tell the story. Would you be interested in hearing that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we have to make a few word choices on it, but this is basically what it's going to say, and I hope everybody get to see it soon. It says, the Thom Reed, Sheffield, Massachusetts UFO incident site. On this road, the night of September 1st, 1969, Thom Reed, his brother, mother, and grandmother were coming from a horse show in nearby Great Barrington, Massachusetts. On the way home in their station wagon car, bright lights were seen all around them and shortly stopped their car. Above them from the northwest was seen an oval-shaped craft. The claim was that they all were stunned to see that 2 hours had passed without remembering it all. Over 250 people called into the police, WSBS radio, and even the local Army Reserve base, who claimed it had no aircraft up that time, but did say their radar showed something strange. All this occurred within 12-mile radius. The Thom Reed incident was the first UFO incident officially inducted into the U.S. history as historically true.
There's something about that just kind of gives you a little chill up the spine.
That's the point.
Now,
and to make you feel like, to give an example, Alan, have you ever been to like Gettysburg National Battlefield or any of those sacred sites where men lost their lives in a horrible war, right?
Right. Yeah.
When you go there and you read a monument or a historical plaque like that, and you say, in this house died such men from such bloody combat, and only somebody died here, you get a feeling of like you said, an eerie feeling. When you walk out on Gettysburg Battlefield, it can make you get chills because there's things you can feel out there that you can only feel in certain places. And that's what Thom, for example, himself, he still feels uncomfortable walking down that road and giving people tours, which we do give people tours in that when they come and ask.
Mm-hmm.
So your question can be answered by yes, that historical marker, the eerie green lights, the giant monument there, the Boulder Monument there, the big one talking about the certificate, and walking in the cornfield. It's an amazing place. We hope to put a kiosk up there soon with a kind of an artist's rendition, it's like a clear plastic with the scene of the way it was, and then it's going to be aimed up in the sky in the exact spot where the craft was seen. That's going to also help people kind of relate what happened here, what it must have been like. And so being 50 years ago, this coming September, yeah, it's half a century. It's definitely history.
There is something about having a marker, having a place to go and reflect. I was just down in Texas, and we went to the Aurora crash site in the cemetery there.
Oh, yes, I live near there. Go ahead, yes.
Okay, cool. So a friend of mine, Ken Cherry, and I went out there just to take a look because I've never been there. And I was commenting about this online. There's just something about being able to drive or travel from point to point that makes something feel more real. It sort of sinks in, and to be there and reflect on it, it's like when you go to the graveyard, an actual graveyard for someone that you love, right? And there's a tombstone there. Now, whether there's someone there or there's ashes or whatever, something about us humans having a physical place to focus our thoughts around is significant. I don't know any other way to express that. And so, yeah, so if you're a history buff, even if you're a non-ufological history buff, there's something about going place to place and going to these markers that make it come to life for you. And being able to reflect on that moment in that place, I think helps you translate it in your brain in a way that just reading in a book doesn't do.
This is very true. It's also, like I could add on to that, is that when I go to see, like maybe a famous actor that I really liked or I grew up with, but he's no longer or she's no longer with us, and you get to go to see the tomb or the grave site of, like you said, where their ashes and remains are, you stand over there, and my theory on that is you feel closer to that person, and you also say, well, you know, this is the closest I'm ever going to get to meeting that person, or this is the closest I'm ever getting to see that. Yeah, it definitely has a feeling. I feel that at many, many places that I go to and see, and you're very correct about that, yes.
What about yourself? Are there any places of significance aside this event that you have found yourself drawn to?
Yes, I sure have. One of my favorite people was years ago, back in, I guess it was about 1980. I went out to California to visit my father, and I went in, and I had just gotten, was on a honeymoon, so to speak, with my first wife. But we decided to go down to Newport News, California, where John Wayne was buried. And what had happened was he died like a year or so, a year before, or a couple years before, and I was going to meet his wife, his second wife, and other things of that nature, but we never hooked up. I spoke to her on the phone once, but we never hooked up. But anyhow, I went to the graveyard where he's buried, Pacific View Memorial Park, and went over there and asked them where John Wayne's, burial site was, resting place, and they said they couldn't tell me. And I go, why? It's unmarked, because originally his wife didn't want it marked, which it is now. I've seen it since then. But when I went there that first time, I felt very upset. I wanted to see the man that I grew up with, who was an icon to me. And all of a sudden, I was out there, and this man comes up to me, and I'm coming out kind of upset in a sense, but quiet. He says, look, I overheard you, sir. I said, do you want to know where John Wayne's buried? I said, yeah, but they won't show me. He goes, follow me. And I followed this gentleman, and we went about maybe a quarter mile from the office and went down, and he walked up this, and there's this one spot by an old tree. He said, that's John Wayne right there. I said, how do you know that for sure? He goes, because I was part of the burial team that buried him here.
Wow.
I said, wow. And so he said, come on over here. And I stood there, and I could stand there, and for a minute, I could feel like I was as close as I was ever going to be to that man, and I felt like, what would it have been if I'd gotten a chance to meet him?
Yeah.
What would it have been like? But I know I was standing above him, and I said, you know what? This is the best as it can be, but I was glad, and I shook the man's hand, and I said, thank you. And then several years later, people were complaining about it, and now there's a marker, finally, to show where he's buried. I don't know, maybe people thought they would try to remove him or dig him up. I don't know why they would want to do that, but there are people like that. But when you talk about things like that, yes, you get to reflect. You want to remember. You want to say, hey, this is as close as I'm going to get this person. How are you doing?
Yes. A monument is more, it's bigger than the actual thing, I think. Because let's say that wasn't John Wayne's grave, right?
Right.
Let's say the Roswell crash happened somewhere a little off where everyone thinks it happened, right? Which I don't think is the case, but just making that up for an example. It doesn't matter as long as you're going to that place, that point of reference, it is moving and it is powerful. So what else are you going to do to sort of, drudge up attention and awareness for the read markers?
Well, as you know, we have we're gonna hopefully put a few more markers, like I said, a kiosk, and maybe even a little tour map. I'm trying to work on where people can see all the sites from this little tiny pocket map kind of thing. Shows you everything, where it took place. I think people will love to have that because they'll feel closer to the incident, the historical event. And what we're also doing is, I don't know if you know, but we have a new motion picture coming out called Inducted that is in pre-production right now that we hope to have it finished before the anniversary. I co-star in that with Thom and many, many other people. I'll be playing myself in the film.
Huh.
With a major TV program coming on, but I can't talk about the name because I'm in a non-disclosure act. But they're going to actually reenact me as a kid, that incident where Jimmy, my friend, and I saw what we saw when Thom was a kid. They're going to people portraying his family. Then they're going to have in the show and the movie, you're going to see me as I am as a judge when I signed the documents that have become famous, and then we're going to do many other radio shows and TV shows and news broadcasts. It's just become a phenomenon. People are going very active with this, and there was years ago when nobody wanted to even talk about it, or wanted to try to erase it from the historical memory. And Thom and I have pushed that so much forward where now they want to be a part of it. And, before they were fighting it. And that's a good thing. And we plan to do more. We're going to make I'm working on getting it under the National Archives or the National Registry of Historical Places. I'm trying to make it almost a sacred historical site like you would anything else that is of extreme national historical significance or interest. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to, the park is going to stay the same, but we're going to prove it with other informational type things. We hope tablets. We've got more plaques getting designed. We have new benches there. There are like 6 benches there. People can sit there, and they all have donations from like Travis Walton, Ancient Aliens, the UFO Roswell Museum, and so many people have donated.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people and organizations were brought together by this. I mean, it really is a good thing for the ufological community.
And it's good, another thing we try to explain to Sheffield, who the people that were frowning or shunning it for a while, the best part about this, Alan, is that it's going to bring tourism into the community where they can, earn more money to help the community, I would think, historical significance. And, of course, Hollywood is coming there, and they filmed so many things over there already with Thom and me and, Ancient Aliens, ABC News, Chronicles. I did a special Chronicles with ABC Boston called Magic Markers that talks about it being now. We're on the historical marker database now. I believe that Kathy Siliker had something to do with that, and she has done some interviews with all the cast and Thom, and I mean, it's just going crazy. There's constant activity on it, and we're glad it's become this, because this is what it should be, and it should be noted for what it is. Now, for instance, some people say, well, I don't believe it. We do believe it. You know what? We let it be known that it's historical fact that something did occur here. Whether you believe it, that's up to you.
Right. And I think that's what ufology is all about. You have to just keep going forward, follow the facts, do the right thing, and to heck with everybody else, because that's just going to drag you down and make you self-conscious, and that's not what you need. We have made such headway in the paranormal and in ufology. Let's not slow down. Let's keep this going. Judge Kevin, thank you so much for your work and for making this happen. Where do you want people to go to find out more about you?
Well, they can find a lot about me on Facebook. Just look for a picture of me with on the set of or the UFO Park, and a picture of my chair with a star and my name. That'll help them find me. And then they can find me also. They can contact me if they like through the UFO Park Monument. Thom Reed, UFO Monument Park. And they can find me on Gmail. I'm pretty easy to find, or out on the web. Just all kinds of places they can find me, and they can contact me on Gmail too.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. This is Alan B. Smith. We will be right back after this one and only break tonight with Thom Reed to find out about him and his family's experience in this 1969 UFO encounter. Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio. We'll be right back.
Ray Sobbs here for SaucerLosAngeles.com, and I hope most of you by now have had the chance to go by and check out the Saucer clothing line, but if you haven't, go to SaucerLosAngeles.com. They've got clothes for men and women of all ages, even babies. All logos are embroidered, and everything is quality made right here in the USA. Go to SaucerLosAngeles.com now to find clothes that can elevate your state of mind because they believe in quality, durability, and they believe in style at SaucerLosAngeles.com.
This is Richard Dolan announcing a new exclusive content website, richarddolanmembers.com. I've been working on this for a long time. Unique weekly podcasts that you won't hear anywhere else, fresh articles and blog posts, a special video series entitled Off the Cuff with Richard Dolan, regular Ask Me Anything style live chat sessions, and more. This is a full-featured member site where you will get my insights, my updates, and be able to interact directly with me. To learn more, go to richarddolanmembers.com.
This is KGRA Digital Broadcasting Station, Salt Lake City, Utah, Van Buren, Arkansas.
Now there's a commercial-free video-on-demand TV channel completely devoted to only the best movies on UFOs, ancient mysteries, conspiracies, and suppressed science. It's called UFO TV All Access. UFO TV All Access is now available on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, Chromecast, UFOTV.com, and download the UFO TV app from Google Play and iTunes. Go to UFOTV.com and subscribe now. That's UFO TV All Access. If it's not UFO TV, it's just a hoax.
Join me, George Norrie, in Indian Wells, California for the 7th Annual Contact in the Desert UFO Conference, May 31st to June 3rd. Contact in the Desert is an epic weekend of adventure filled with exciting explorations into ancient aliens, human origins, crop circles, UFO sightings, disclosure, and the newest evidence of ongoing contact. This amazing weekend offers over 50 lectures, 40 workshops, 8 exciting panels, special events, and a luncheon that I'm hosting. Contact in the Desert also features leading experts including Giorgio Tsoukalos, David Wilcock, Linda Moulton Howe, Michael Tellinger, Eric Von Daniken, Doc Wallach, and many more important researchers and scientists in the field. Contact in the Desert is your place for inside information. Join us at thecontactinthedesert.com to get your tickets today. It's time to make contact. That's contactinthedesert.com. Don't miss it. Contactinthedesert.com.
We are the contact for alternative research topics. The Planet, KGRARadio.com.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, and our next guest, coming up in just a moment, is Thomas Reed of the Reed family from the 1969 UFO encounter. As a friendly reminder, our bumper music tonight was brought to you by Septembrio.com, so go check those guys out. Give them some love and support. Not only are they great artists, but they're good people, and they make this program what it is. Because that sense of mystery, that sense of paranormal wonder is imbued into the music, and I really appreciate those guys. So, Michael, if you're listening tonight, much love to you, brother. Thomas E. Reed is the original founder of the international model and artist group Miami Models, founded in 1994. The trademarked Miami Models had clients, Polo Black Label, Tommy Hilfiger, Nike, and Ralph Lauren. He was also the booking agent for the Miami Dolphin cheerleaders from 2003 to 2006. Not a bad gig. Early life from 1960 through 1962. Reed lived in the home of William Roosevelt, the grandson of President Roosevelt, in Cherry Hills, Colorado. His mother and grandmother were employed by the Roosevelts with residence on property. His father, Dr. Howard Reed, an attorney and Connecticut politician. Thom relocated to Miami Beach, where he shot model composite cards for renowned agencies. Michelle Palmier, Wilhelmia, The Green Agency, Boca Talent, and Click. In 1994, he founded Miami Models. And by 1999, the model management firm was renowned for European print fashion and runway. Reed has been the subject of over a dozen documentaries and or feature films with numerous guest appearances as himself. But what he's really known for is that UFO incident that made headlines in 2015 when it became, quote, historically true. Thom, welcome to Paranormal Now.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I appreciate it. So we did hear from Kevin Titus, and we got a little bit of an overview of the story, but we didn't get that first-person point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you just take us back in time and tell us your story?
What actually happened? To start with the incident. Okay. If you know New England, and this is really important because if I can just start with this, our incident had a lot of support early on because of who my family was and the connections they had in the local politics and that sort of thing. And that's really how we broke into mainstream and got the support that we did and how we got to where we are today. And that plays a part with what you just mentioned about my grandmother actually being the governess for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandchildren in Cherry Hills, Colorado, where I lived for a couple of years until my mother got divorced, if you will, made some money, moved into New England. And the reason she went back to New England or the Southern Berkshires, if you will, is because our family really are from New York, you know, Hollis, Queens, Patchogue, and that sort of thing. So when we moved to Sheffield, we were really outsiders from the start because if you've ever been there, back in the day, I mean, it was a lot of horse tracks. It was a lot of farming in Sheffield, and my mother always had a love for horses. And so to kind of fit in, my mother started, she raised racehorses for the Great Barrington Racetrack, which was at the time considered the grand jewel of racing outside Saratoga, And so with that said, I was actually riding a horse in competition on September 1st, 1969 for the 4-H club that I was in. And I actually my saddle came loose and I got a brown ribbon and I was pretty upset about it because I was riding with kids from school. And so my mother said, let's get out of here. Let's leave early. We'll go out for a burger or something like that, and then we'll go back to the restaurant and put the chairs up, the whole thing, make the night deposit drop, and we'll head home. Tomorrow's a big day. So with that said, we went back to our diner, and we had it, normally we closed early, but because it was a holiday, we kept it open later. And it was kind of a mess, so we ended up staying there for several hours trying to put the chairs up and clean the grill and all that kind of stuff. And about 8:30, my mother said, well, it's time to go. The kids need to be in bed by 9. And so rather than go all the way up to Kellogg, those who know the area, and shoot across to Boardman and all the way home, my mother knew this shortcut over this bridge, the Sheffield Bridge, and that's how we decided to go. It was very rural. It was a very hot night. It was about 90 degrees, and really hot for New England in September. And so the windows were open. And we were kind of just sitting there and having some candy, and I was giving my brother a Fireball. And I don't know why I remember that so vividly, except my grandmother thought he could choke, so she had commented on it. And as we were coming down this little bit of an incline to the bridge, my grandmother actually was the first one to notice that the headlights from her station wagon didn't really seem to make sense with the amount of bleed or light that we had seen, or she had seen, I should say, as we entered the bridge. That's the first thing that did not make sense. And as we went across the bridge, and back then it was very clanky. You know, you had the boards or bump, 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 bump as you drove over, because they weren't, the planks weren't tight. And that's where this bleed of light seemed to come through. And as we came out the other side of the bridge, my grandmother had turned around. She was in the passenger seat. So my mother was driving. My grandmother was in the passenger seat. And this is quite important for me anyway, and of our family. We're very confused about what happened here. My grandmother, again, was in the passenger seat. My brother was sitting behind my grandmother on the passenger side of the vehicle. I was behind my mother. My mother was driving. And sure enough, we saw this large sphere that was basically rising out of the banks of the Housatonic River. Now, to clarify some things, I have never once said it came out of the water. I said I saw it rise from the banks, and it did, and it was about 4.
It was just resting on the bank, you think?
You know, I don't even want to say that, because when I turned and looked out the window, it was already probably maybe 10 to 15 feet above the bank, but my grandmother had saw it rise up, not me. And so when it rose up, and it was probably about 4 times the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. Now, I was 10 years old, almost 10, so I remember things I reference things that I saw as a child, and this was how I've sized it. Was we used to have a Volkswagen Beetle later on, so I thought, yeah, it's about the size of what we saw, and it rose up. And at first, it was very self-contained. It looked, in many ways, just like a bubble, like if you had blown bubbles. You know, it had the tighter seal around it. It wasn't like blooming. Now, as it rose up, one of the things I'll never forget was that it had what looked like rods of focused light that shot or looked like it shot into the water. So I mentioned, like to Ancient Aliens when they did the show, that it reminded me of an ice cream cone. And when I met with ABC News, I said it looked kind of like an upside-down Hershey's Kiss, because it did have that pointed bottom, if you will, as it rose up. Now, of course, Ancient Aliens made it look like a sugar cone, but there were only, I remember, like firing these rods into the water.
Well, do you think that it could have been similar to the Kecksburg UFO, that sort of shape?
You know, I don't really know. Or an acorn
shape. I don't know. Would that be similar to what you're describing?
This was a circle, and these rods that fired in downward. It was a long time ago, but I don't remember them actually coming off the bottom of this sphere, if you will. I believe that it kind of just came off the sides of it. If I were to that would be my guess, because they were wide. You know, it wasn't like it was coming from the bottom. They were wide rods, and they were very focused, almost, you know, like if you were to have a tube. I mean, there was no bleed of light. That's the main thing in the beginning. There was no bleed of light from anything. Everything seemed very tight, if that makes sense. And it rose up, and it started to move in the direction of our car. Now, some of the shows, again, show this craft or vehicle or what have you over our station wagon. It never was over our station wagon. It was quite a ways back, maybe 50 yards, give or take. The area is still there now. You can walk it off. I mean, that's where it went, behind this line of trees. Now, what was interesting here, this was a very bumpy dirt road. And when you came off this bridge, and something you don't hear about and nobody shows you this, there was a ramp that went down a board. So when you went up the bridge, you had to climb up these planks, go across the bridge, and back down these planks. So our station wagon going up and down these rickety planks, we weren't going more than like 15 miles an hour. It's not like we shot through the bridge like some people think. No, you could probably run as fast as we were going over this bridge. And so the light itself, or the sphere that we saw, had gained momentum on the car. if that makes sense. So it was ahead of the car. And the reason we knew that, there was now a bleed of light coming through the trees to our left side. And when we saw it, it was self-contained. So there was a change in what took place there. Now, as my mother was like looking at this thing out the driver's window, which was open, and like, what is this? So we went up the road and we pulled off to the right, which was right before the very first telephone pole that used to go down this old dirt road. Now, when we stopped, my brother was really looking for this thing because we thought it would be ahead of us and that we would have seen it when we stopped, and we did not. My brother was looking around. We were all looking around to see, where could this thing have gone? And he noticed off to the right of the car an orangey-looking orb. Now, I say orange, red, but the thing about what we saw now was very low, but it was also over a bank of water because the water wrapped around kind of like a J. And this was also over water, probably about 70 to 80 yards off to the right of the car. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to be moving in some way, the inner part of this orangey orb, if you will, or sphere, seemed to be moving internally. And that my brother was really focused on that.
Well, how would you describe that? Something like a lava lamp, or? No,
I would say, for your listeners, I would say if you see the sun and you see like the little, the flares, and you see some movement, it was almost like an ocean wave. Something was moving or turning, whereas the white one was not. That was just like a self-contained, sphere with light within it, contained within it, until we saw the light bleed through the trees, and we don't know where that came from. Okay. So to give you
anyone listening, don't stare at the sun too long, despite what some leaders might do. Okay.
Good point, Alan. So as we were parked, my brother was now focused on what was going on off to the right, which was this orangey-looking sphere, if you will. I was still looking to the left. I was on the left side of the car. My mother was looking to the left. And that's when we saw what looked like and again, it looked like a turtle shell to me. Again, I was referencing something that I remembered as a child. And it wasn't shiny chrome. It didn't have pointed, corners to it. There was no landing gear. There was no windows. It just looked like a turtle shell would with a wide lip around it. And this thing was probably, some people say half the size of a football field. I was young. It seemed much bigger to me than that. But then again, a lot of things did. I went back to my old house, and I thought it was bigger than I remember as a child. So I'm open to that. But I remember seeing this thing about 3 stories up. It was very big, probably 3 times the length of maybe like a trailer, a mobile home, if you will. I've referenced that as well. And it was, like I said, it was right there. And now we never saw the white light again, per se. The orange one was still on the other side of us, and this craft was right there in Sheffield, not far from the bridge, maybe 300 yards from the bridge, and it was just hovering. No sound, no anything, a little bit of a light underneath it. Now, this is what I need to tell your listeners to understand here. So there were 3 pieces to this, okay? So if you look at Discovery Channel and what they did for a show, they show this craft over a vehicle, no light. If you look at Unsolved Mysteries, they show something different. If you look at what Ancient Aliens did, they focused on the ball of light. But what really happened was there was 3 parts to this. There was the orb to the left of our car. There was the orange orb, if you will, or sphere off to the right. And then as we went down further, there was the craft much further ahead. So there was 3 pieces to this, almost like a pyramid.
Now, of these 3, you described a bubble-like description. Do they all have a crossover similarity in that regard?
I'm sorry, in what respect?
Like a really smooth, rounded surface. They all match that?
These
are the same sort of craft.
Well, no. The craft that we saw in the field was nothing like the orbs or the spheres. No. So you had 2 spheres that, if that one looked very similar to a very small sun, let's say. The one to the left was a self-contained whitish sphere. Okay. Now, when we came off the bridge, one of those spheres would have been to the right, the orange one, and the white one, if you will, to the left. So as we moved forward and got to where the craft was up the road, by that point we were in the middle of all three of these objects. Now, what else is interesting about this? When we came off the bridge, and you might have heard an old interview with me or my brother, what have you, we did feel odd. It was almost like we had gone, the best way to describe this would be if you had gone underwater and you had someone, tapping in the pool. It echoes. So these little sounds carried, they were very pronounced, but yet we started to feel very out of it, very, almost like we were in this like vacuum of silence that had echoing and tapping sounds. And the first thing that I remember that seemed odd about the sounds around me was when we were pulling off, this dirt road had a lot of old gravel and stones because water used to wash across the street. So I was hearing like ding, tap, 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 these stones that were being picked up by the back tires that were hitting underneath the wells of the wheel wells. And I remember that, and it's just weird things that I remember, and I remember ting, 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 and it echoed, and it was so loud to me, yet everything around me seemed dull, except for these little sounds.
That's odd. Now, I've had experiences where you've had sort of panicky moments where your brain and your adrenaline goes into hyperdrive, and things do feel like they sort of slow down. There's a kind of like a whoom, whoom effect. Now, so do you think that was from your own internal source out of kicking into survivor mode, or do you really think that some outside force was affecting this?
Well, not if all four of us felt it at the same time. So you have to look at that too. But to be quite honest with you, no, I think and I'm going to reflect back. I'm going to jump ahead and get back here. But my father and I later on did a lot of investigations on the neurons in your brain and how they're affected by electro or ELF. And there are certain frequencies that will cause that, just, like the wonderful work Harp was once doing, that you can, if you are in line, if you will, with some ELF or fields that can trigger the neurons and affect a comatose state or happiness or sadness. So I like to think, or I'm more impelled or compelled to think that would be something that affected us. What we were in a field of some type of a communication that affected our heads, and that's really what I think happened here, because all four of us were affected by this at the exact same time. Now, I'll tell you from my perspective, I was sitting in the back seat, and so what happened with me personally was, again, we were looking at this thing, and then all of a sudden there was this eruption of katydids and crickets and frogs, that sound, and it was just unbelievably loud. So whatever this was not only affected us, but when it stopped and went back to normal, everything around us, the wildlife, erupted.
So to answer, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And that's why Bletchman wanted to mention this at the UN in support of Carson Landerman, but we'll get into that later. So to answer your question, do I think that it was my own body or feelings or my own, you're not experiencing something like this before, did my body react differently to it? No, we were all affected. So was the wildlife, or so was what we heard around us was affected by it. And so at that point, all of a sudden, the car lit up like someone had floodlights in our car. And what was interesting about this, too, is now I could see, we had a blue car with blue interior, but I could see the dashboard. I could see my mother. I could see everything in the car was as bright as could be. And yet I was still in this kind of a funk, but everything lit up around me. And then, bang, that was all I remember. And at that point, what I remember from that night is still very bothersome to me, but it is what it is, and that's I remember being in what resembled like a large airplane hangar. Now, I'm not saying it was an airplane hangar; it resembled an airplane hangar. And one of the things I really remember from that time was that I looked up on the walls into the ceiling because I was in this huge open area that was fairly dark, and there were some lights along where the ceiling and the walls met. And if you can envision a single fluorescent tube, that's what it looked like a tube, a light, a space, a tube, a space, a tube, a space. And this went on for, I don't know, it seemed huge to me. High ceilings, totally empty. And I was actually, when I got there, I remember these carts off to the right that resembled what I saw in classrooms in school, where you'd put a projector on back in the day to maybe show a slideshow in school. These carts to the right of me, and I had actually split off something. I don't remember looking back to see what it was, but I was on some type of a table or gurney or cart, and I had slipped off this thing onto my feet. And soon as that happened, I was grabbed by my left arm, right around the muscle of my left arm, and I was pushed through this room. This was not gentle. This was military or harsh or it was an aggressive type of moment in this whole thing, and it seemed very orchestrated and organized. And I was taken out a door. I was taken down this hallway, which was very thin, tall walls, again lit up, and it was a left and a right. These weren't curvy rooms or curvy hallways. This was very industrial by design. And when I got to the end of this hall, I was taken to a left and into this room. And something else that I really want to stress was that this table that I was to sit on, if you will, had a single support in the middle of it that went to the ground and or the floor, and it reminded me, now looking back as 50 years later, as an autopsy table.
Well, what were the surfaces like? What was this table like? What did it feel like?
To be honest with you, it was a long time ago, but it was hard. It wasn't soft. I'd say it was, a lot of people say they had these, chrome silver tables. This, I believe, was almost like an off-white. Again, it was a long time ago. But it seemed to turn, and it rose from the floor. And this piece above it, which also had the same center support in it, like the one rod, a piece lowered over me, and I was on this table, and I'll get into that in a second. But what I saw then, sitting on this, I don't know what you'd call it, really. I don't want to call it a table. I don't know what it was. It was just like this thing that rose from the floor, and I sat on it. There were these, entities or other life forms, if you will, that were off to the left of me, maybe 15 feet to my left, and they were looking straight into a wall. There were two of them, and it was almost like whatever they were doing, they were working on this flat wall. What they probably could see something in their work. I don't know what they were actually doing, but they were focused on this part of this wall, and one of them turned, and it looked like it had a head the size of maybe a large football, and it reminded me of today. It reminded me, looking back, as the head of an ant, and it had this odd body, and I've drawn it. I've sketched it later on. It hung on my fourth grade classroom chalkboard, and I still have it today. Basically, I mean, it's a copy of what I drew, but from old papers, but it's very different from what a lot of people have experienced. And this room again that I was in, which is very key to me, because wherever I was, wherever my brother was, my family, whatever happened that night, this was not the craft, because where we were was so much bigger than what we saw. Now, I definitely worked in conjunction with what we saw, but this was not the craft itself. So people say to me a lot of, you were, abducted in 1969. Yes, we were taken, and we were abducted, but where we were was not the craft, unless there was another piece that we didn't see, which is by all means a possibility.
When this was happening, did you say to yourself, "I'm being abducted"?
I would never have known that term back in 1969. I mean, of course not. I was like, I don't know where I was. I don't know what happened. I mean, I was just.
Let's say it was a more human experience, and someone abducted you. A human abducted you and took you away. You would say to yourself, "Someone stole me away from my life." You know that something is terribly wrong, and that someone ripped you from your everyday reality. So you must have had some processing, like, "Whoa, some terrible thing has just been done to me." There must have been an intense fear factor there.
Yes, I would agree with all that, everything you said. But I wasn't using terminology back then because it was. Let me tell you what happened here, and you'll see what I mean. This room that I was in bowed inward like a can would. So where I was sitting and what I saw to my left and what bowed inward almost looked like cubed glass. That block cube glass. And off to the right of that was also what looked like an exit, an opening. And so I ran to the right away from what I saw. And when I got into this, what basically was a large hallway. And when I say a large hallway, I would say if you've ever been to, let's say Walmart and empty it out, an empty Walmart, and there was what looked like a
big image, but
yeah, exactly. I know, but I'm trying to paint a picture for people here.
Sure.
Off to the left, there was an entrance or exit that was as wide as a four-lane highway. And off to the right, there were two entrances or exits, if you will, that were about half that size. So if you were looking down on where I was, it would look like a circle with a Y through it. And I ran out, and there was nothing there. And I heard voices. I've mentioned this, for 30 years. I heard what my believed to be my mother calling out for me. She said she was calling out for me. I heard other people there. And I was grabbed and brought back into this room, placed on this table that reminded me of an autopsy table, at least it does today. And this piece came over me, which, if to paint a picture, like a top of a tanning bed or an MRI machine of some kind, there was a couple tapping sounds. I remember a bump to my head, which hurt. There were packets put on my body that resembled large raisin packs. And then that's basically what I remember, and I was back in this large area where this whole thing started, and then the next thing I know, I'm back in the car.
Tom, what do you mean by raisin packs?
What I remember were these packs that were put on my body that were probably maybe about the size of a mouse for your computer, and they were black. And the closest thing that I can, reference would be a large raisin. And so Discovery Channel, of course, put rocks on my body. I never said they were rocks, but they were raisin pack. They looked like large raisins. Now, whether something was being, coming from that and entering my body, whether that was something that was extracting something from my body, obviously I don't know. But I had like several of them, and they were being put onto my body through these holes that were in the sides of this piece that came over my body. Now, I could still see my, my chest and my legs and my feet, and I could see these hands, if you will, or whatever, coming through the sides and placing them on my left side, nothing on my right. And that's another thing. Everything I remember from 69 took place on my left. I was grabbed harshly on my left arm. The packs that were put on my leg and at my upper body, if you will, came from my left side. And there were other figures in there as well, if you will, or entities, or hybrids, or humans. I have to be honest with everybody. I mean, I was very young, but my mother and my grandmother and my brother and I have, talked about this, our whole lives. And I guess the best way to explain to you how we've come to a conclusion on some of this stuff is if you're in a mall and you're with your brother and your mother and a family member, 4 of you, and one of you is, in JCPenney and others in Sears, if the Sears, okay, Sears is closed, but if, the food court or what have you, and all of a sudden an explosion or something happens in a mall, you're all seeing this from a different perspective, but you all saw it. So you see this from almost, a 3D type of thing, I saw this or I saw that. What did you hear first? Well, I saw this window explode. So that's how we put this together. My brother remembers something my brother had a club foot. So he remembers attention being put to his club foot. My mother was scared to death. My grandmother later on was acting very peculiar. And I'll get to that in a second, but let me jump back to this car now. So after this happened, I was back in the same position. My brother was in the same position, but my mother and grandmother were reversed in the car. Now, when we stopped at that telephone pole and we're looking at the craft when we had that eruption, like I said, of crickets and wildlife around us that was very intense. That's the last thing we really remember with that light.
And you, Thom, you remember all of this consciously?
Absolutely. We all do. And so that moment that took place, my mother had the car running. She never turned it off. We had the lights on. It was, about 9:15 at night. And when we got back to the car, if you will, nobody was awake at this point. My grandmother was the first one to come to, and we didn't all come to at the same time. My grandmother woke up first. My mother was not responding. My grandmother, first thing she did was start the car and started to head home, but home was several miles from there where town was only a quarter mile back. So my grandmother, with nobody responding to her in the car, had turned the car back and went back over the bridge, went up to what was Bridges restaurant there, took a left and went into town. And she was in such an odd state herself. She went flying by the town, actually, and finally turned in at the last part where you can get into this parking area for all these stores, which was like an access road, really. And she pulled up to Silks. Now, Silks is still there to this day. And so my grandmother got out and went into Silks. And when the door slammed, being, I think, behind the driver's seat now, it woke me because I was the second one to come to. Now, this was only maybe, 4 or 5 minutes after my grandmother had come to and driven there. But I got out and I started to follow my grandmother in because no one else was responding to me either. And I was like, Nana, and I ran up to her and she, for whatever reason, didn't really acknowledge me. And I just went into Silks with her and she went right past the clerk. Now, Silks was a store that was, you could hit Silks from our diner with a Frisbee. I mean, it was right there. And my grandmother, oddly enough, when we left our diner, she had actually gone there for Tarrington cigarettes before we went home. She smoked Tarrington cigarettes. So she had just what she thought left there 10 minutes ago. When we got back, they were closing at 11 o'clock. So this was almost 3 hours. You hear a lot of shows say, they were gone for, they lost time for, it was almost 3 hours, not 2. And when we went in there, she didn't really know what to ask her, say we need help, but not help for what. And then all of a sudden she drifted off and went to the far back of Silk store, and she got tangled in all these bikes and strollers. And she grabbed a stroller and she started pushing it back and forth like a child was in it. slowly, but in a weird funk, and that was disturbing.
Well, especially as a child seeing that's I think even more disturbing.
Yeah, and we ask why. Was there something that was? Did she experience something of a female nature that might have made her feel compelled to do that? But I tried to grab her arm, and I was trying to pull her through the bikes. I mean, this is how weird this night was, because there's no way she could have came to where I was pulling her. She said, there were bikes and strollers and carriages, and I'm trying to grab her arm to pull her through this stuff, is what the guy from Silk said too. And it didn't the whole thing didn't make sense. We were just not in our right mind. And then she went back past the clerk, stopped, and then didn't really say anything, and then went back down the outside the door and out to in front of the car. And now my mother was standing outside the car, and my brother was still unconscious.
You said you remember the abduction consciously, but it sounds to me like this portion of the story you were kind of in and out of it.
Well, my brother says that when he came to, he was the last one to come to, that it was almost like a sodium pentothal. We've all had surgeries. We've all been under, and it did seem more like that. It did seem like we were drugged. Mm-hmm. And so this is why it's hard for us to really pin down what we experienced, because it's not like what a lot of other people have told us what happened to them, and so it's difficult to really nail this down. But if I were to guess, I would say we were at the wrong place at the wrong time. We saw something we shouldn't have seen. There was military involved in this, because there was. We had Sikorsky. We had Command Aerospace. We had Pratt & Whitney, GE. We had, there's Nike missile sites up there. There's Minuteman missile sites, the Cold War, and everything. Electric Boat, the Groton Naval Base, which makes nuclear submarines. New York City is an hour and 20 minutes. There's a lot going on there. So back in the day, a lot of people thought, well, experience, what happened to you was probably more local than you realize. But what we saw there's no question that what we saw was off-world. So I think there was more than one thing going on here, and that's the only way that I
you say.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You say off-world, but coming from the chat room here, we've got some comments and questions melded into one by Neutron and Digger, and that is, could this have been something underground? Could they have taken you in a craft or a facility underground?
Oh, I believe that. I would say whoever asked you that question nailed it, because that's how I feel.
Well, why do you feel that way?
Because of what we saw. I mean, what we saw was not super high tech. It was very industrial by design. As far as the craft and the orbs and the lights that we saw, if you will, that was certainly off-world. I mean, that was something that is still being seen today in the area. There's a lot of activity out there, but where we were seemed very, again, it seemed, it was not that high tech,
Could it have been, I wonder, could it have been something like, for us, an aircraft carrier that's, really old, but still in commission?
No, it wasn't that old. No, it was pretty, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the, the room with the boat in glass and the pockets that it had, and this, and having this huge open area with this weird configuration, which I think was probably to control the flow of traffic. Now, I'd say where I was, to be honest with you, is probably the size of maybe 3 or 4 Walmart stores. I mean, that's how big it was. And what else is?
When I made my analogy, what I was meant for was their version of an old ship, an old tech. I mean,
that's true too. That could be true. Yes. Okay.
But your instinct, your intuition, or whatever, tells you that it felt like something more earthly? Would it be our earthly facility that we are working with ETs, or was it their facility?
I think it was a facility that, well, first of all, the mining for the atom bomb, that magnesium, and the government that mined for that was only 3 miles from there. And that facility is actually underground. It's actually in a town called Falls Village. And if you go to Falls Village and you look for the waterfall, you'll find the signs, and this entire building is underground. Now, I've never been in there willingly, but I'm pretty sure that that's where we were. I know Kevin Titus has looked into that. Pretty much everybody in the area knows about it, because they were mining all the way to the 60s and 70s for magnesium, which has been being shipped to Oak Ridge, or Y12, where Stanton Friedman used to work. So I think we were extracted by our vehicle. We were taken there. I think that there was probably a joint venture taking place there. And again, if there was a craft that, that maybe our military was trying to operate, maybe that's why we saw it. Maybe something they couldn't control it. At the same time, what we saw then again, to me, looked very orchestrated with the way the orbs were. I say orbs, spheres were behaving. They seem to, up and move and do their thing in a way that you would expect something with intelligent control. But anyway, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Say sphere rather than orb, because in the paranormal community, if you talk about orbs, it can get hot and debated real fast. So I think actually it's a better description to say sphere, because this isn't just some floating, globule that you caught on camera.
Right.
This is something that you saw was in a 3-dimensional space.
Okay. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, but then again, look at it this way too. Kevin nor I are really big, into this field. This is just something that happened to my family. We've got lives elsewhere, so sometimes my verbiage is not going to be perhaps what you're used to hearing. But at the same time, this is what we saw. So regardless of how I reference it, I mean, this is what it looked like to us. And to take this a step further now, the next day, unknown to us, we went into the restaurant to open it up, and sure enough, we used to actually have this diner that was not far from the school, and with that, a lot of the kids in the area would eat breakfast at our diner, and there's a reason for that too, because this was a farming community. A lot of people did not, want their parents did not want their children walking a half a mile for the school bus, because these farms are so big. Someone had to take them to the school bus, and rather than just take them and let them wait at the side of the road in February in the snow, they would just take their children to the diner. We would all eat together. Everyone ran a tab, and then we would all walk to school together. And so these children that have spoken out now are those, the children that spoke out about this back then are the same people that speak out about it now, because they were all part of this. And this is what's really interesting about our incident, was that when this happened, it was a holiday, so there were a lot of families that were outside with mixed groups of people having barbecues and going to public places, and a lot of these people saw what we encountered that same night. And so that was aired on the radio while these kids and everybody that was eating in our restaurant, they heard it. And so, we were talking about it earlier, and all of a sudden, bang, it's on the radio. And these kids were like, oh, that's my Uncle Bill, or that's John, or that's so-and-so from the local gas station, or whatever, because so many people reported it. So Tom J., who was the radio personality for WSBS back then, and his wife still remembers it today, he's a ham radio operator. So these calls were coming in, and he was picking it up on his ham radio. And so he's like, okay, this is too much. And so he actually called the Great Barrington Police Department. That's where the radio station was in Great Barrington. He used to call them anyway for the news in the morning. And so, they said, we're getting floods of, this is, our phones are burning up. So he went back to the radio station and actually got back on the air because WSBS was off air right now. And so he's like, hey, we're getting reports for this. We're getting reports of these sightings. Does anybody know what's going on out there? Where can we find this? And with that, this Jan Green, who used to run and own, her family did, the local pharmacy in town, had heard it over the radio saying, okay, where is this thing? And so she saw it and drove right down to the radio station and just knocked on their door and pounded on it, actually, to say, look, if you guys would just get outside and look over there, you'd see it for yourself. And so she actually made that effort to go to the station, which is why she's so important in this. And then, of course, all these other kids and their relatives and family members, all, heard it in the station. And then these golfers who actually had seen it just before dark at the Egremont Country Club had actually made a report, which ended up getting a Hynek classification. It was only issued a CE1, but it was reported as this craft that was performing acrobatical movements unknown to conventional aircraft. And so with that and the other reports, you can actually follow where this craft came from. It kind of came from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It went through Stockbridge, which is, the Norman Rockwell, Alice's Restaurant. And by the way, that's where Story Musgrave, used to live, which was only about 7 miles from our house. But, he's much older than I was, but he's from the area. And you could go right through Great Barrington. So somewhere between Great Barrington and Sheffield, this craft actually crossed the highway, Route 7. And that's where Gina Paul and her sister saw it, and her father, actually, because they were having a barbecue. But oddly enough, the Pauls lived on our street. So they actually saw it just before we ran into it. So we actually had passed the craft, because where we started from was basically where the first people saw it. So we got way ahead of it, and then turned back, and going back towards Great Barrington to go through that bridge, we collided with it. That's kind of how this whole thing happened on September 1st.
Earlier you had mentioned Discovery Channel or other shows sort of misrepresenting the craft. Does that really bother you? And is that part of the motivation for doing your own film, I guess somewhat soon?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for me wanting to do that. First of all, how this got inducted and those who supported us and those who supported my father, we have a lot of mainstream support from the Governor Charles D. Baker to the Lieutenant Governor to the Historical Society, the Great Barrington Historical Society. Titus has gone out on a limb. WSBS Radio, which reported it, still supports it, as does the chief of police's son, who kept the peace in our restaurant over the fighting that broke out over it. And I got to mention this first, how this ended up getting inducted. There's two major pieces to this, because a lot of people ask me, why your case? Why not so-and-so's case? Okay.
Quickly, for those who may have tuned in late, when you say inducted into the historical record.
Well, inducted into United States history is historically true in America. It's the first case in America. This is the first case in America to be inducted by state government as a true event. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't understand that either. There is no, Betty and Barney Hill were the first to be recognized. Travis is a legacy. You've got, Roswell and everything else. But this case was actually the first case to be officially inducted into U.S. history as historically true. A lot of people don't know that, and they play it off a lot. That's the truth. This is historical. This is now an historical landmark. It was inducted by Charles D. Baker, the state governor.
It holds up in a court of law.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's more than that, too. It's actually bona fide history.
Right.
It's not a marker, just a marker. It's not a landmark. It's not a myth. This was archived. As a matter of fact, the article that I got said that we now reside next to the Boston Tea Party and Paul Revere in the archives of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts history.
Yeah,
it's that important. So okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Thom.
So this is what I want to share with people. My father was, yes, he was a mayor of Canaan, Connecticut, and he was an attorney, and he advocated the incident that took place in Sheffield and Great Barrington because we were all part of that family, and a lot of these, like I said, these kids that rode those banana seat bikes and walked to school with us and everything are now historians. They're doctors. They're lawyers. They're police officers. And so when my father was killed on the same day that this incident went before the United Nations by our legally retained attorney, Bletchman, in support of 33-426, when this case, or our family's case, went in support of Cash Landerman because of the environment that this stirred up around our family and how we felt. Muhammad Ramadan was the head of the parapsychology back then, and so there was this powwow, and Stanton Friedman was there, Linda Morton Howell was there, and our attorney actually organized this entire event with Muhammad Ramadan. And so when my father passed, oddly, on that same day, we can get into that later, but a lot of
4 minutes left here.
Yeah, well, a lot of people wanted to pay tribute to my late father for advocating this, because there was like, why did he pass? What happened? And so with that, these historians said, let's put it through a census. How did this happen? What happened to your father? But so they put it to a census. They said, did their family's incident or the restaurant, their diner, and everything that took place, did it alter the natural progression of the community? And they voted in that it did. So that went to the State Historical Society, that went to the governor, and they said, okay, look, if it altered the natural progression of the community and it involved an off-world incident, then the incident itself and how it affected the community was historically significant. And that's how it got inducted into state. And
that's very cool, Thom. That's very elucidating. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So at the same time, the monument that they call a monument was never to be a monument. It was actually a marker with my father's name on it that went into place at the park. But then it got destroyed. I got a call from the chief of police, Eric Munson. He said, look, we're going to put the governor's citation on it to deter any more problems or vandalism. And then all of a sudden these people started donating to the park, and now we've got a free to the public park at the exact location of where this took place. And it's being built by sponsors, people from X-Files, Ben Hansen, Travis Walton, the Roswell Museum sponsors it, Shockwave Motors, an electrical car manufacturer, backs it. A lot of people back it now. Yeah. And so now we've got a park at the exact location of the incident that really pays tribute to my late father.
That's a beautiful thing. I have one last question that's coming from the chat room. These entities, when you were abducted, were they communicating telepathically, or was there no communication really other than physical gestures and pushing you here and there?
Yeah. What grabbed me on my left arm, I can't remember what that looked like, if it was humanoid, or I believe that I certainly was scared. I believe that it was obvious to someone else that I was feeling uncomfortable. Do I remember any communication or anything like that? No, but it just seemed like there was a mix, like there was what looked like a human element and then something that was definitely not human. And there was this mix. And the one thing that I do feel is that whatever this was that reminded me of an ant, that for some reason I feel like there was some communication with that. And it was a long time ago, but so I would say yes to that and no to other parts of it, if that makes sense. I think there was a mix, human, and non-human and working together wherever it was that I spent those 3 hours.
Yeah. This May 18th in Pine Bush, New York. Will you be there for the UFO fair?
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to be. I took a Bill from KGRA Radio actually was very helpful by interviewing 4 or 5 people that have never gone on record before that will be shown their testimony at Pine Bush, and it has to do with the officer's son. It has to do with Linda Farrell, who used to live above our diner, who remembers the whole thing. A slew of people. Oh. And so Bill got the footage, and we are going to show it for the very, very first time. And to be honest with you, I want to close with this. These people that went public, I have not seen since I was 14 years old. Hmm. These are not people I've stayed in touch with. That's
how profound that was for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, Thom, thank you so much. Hopefully I'll get to bump into you at Pine Bush. So for everybody listening, if you're in the New York or tri-state area, let's go. Let's all go together. We'll have a good time at Pine Bush UFO Fair. You can just go to the website, pinebushufofair.com. And to find out more about Thom, go to Thom Reed, THOMREED.net. Thom, thanks again, and have a great night.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio, your official contact for the best in alternative talk radio. You can find out more by going to kgrradio.com/paranormalnow, or you can find me on Twitter at paranormal_now. A special thanks to Race and Bill at KGRA. And until next time, live in the mystery.
Thanks again.